Welcome to our Palm Sunday service and the final service in our series on Unitarian Universalist faith. We open our worship today with a chalice lighting by David O. Rankin, Waving the Palms. Palm Sunday is found whenever we are serving a noble and unpopular cause with selfless devotion, holding to the ideals of truth and justice. Whenever we are seeking to uplift the fallen, to comfort the brokenhearted, to strengthen and encourage the weak and hopeless. Whenever that we're working bravely and persistently in the face of abuse and criticism to establish more equitable relations in the world. Whenever we are sacrificing our lives in behalf of what we believe to be in the service of love for all humanity. Then that is Palm Sunday.
Good morning. So today, or tonight last night, today's Sunday. Last night would have been the first night of Passover this year, when Jewish families all over the world get together and have a big meal called a Seder, and we tell each other the story of Exodus, of the Jews who were slaves in Egypt and how they got out and set up their own communities. So it's a really long thing, and dinner goes on for hours and hours and hours, and you tell a story and you sing songs and you eat a lot. So I'm just going to tell a little tiny bit of what the Seder is about. And I'm going to show you our Seder plate. So this is a special plate. This one did belong to my mother, so I've had it for many years. And on the Seder plate, we put foods that symbolize different things. We have a lamb shank bone that's for the lamb that was sacrificed in the temple. We have greens, usually parsley nowadays, to symbolize new growth in spring. We have a roasted egg, which that one's hard boiled, but that's okay. And that also symbolizes new birth and growth. We have a little bowl of salt water. That's the tears of the Jewish people while they labored in slavery. And horseradish, that's the bitterness of slavery. And then we have a little dish of apples and nuts and honey called haroset. And that's also a sweet thing, but it's also supposed to, well, it doesn't really, but it's supposed to look like the mortar that held the bricks together that the Hebrews used to build great palaces and pyramids for the pharaohs in Egypt. And then we also eat matzah, which is the flat, unleavened bread, because when the Hebrews left out of Egypt, they had to do it in a hurry. And so they didn't have time to let the bread rise. So we eat this flat, unleavened bread. One of the things we do during the Seder is we put out a cup of wine, and this is my special Elijah cup that I've always used. We put out a cup of wine for the prophet Elijah, because Elijah is supposed to signify the coming of the Savior and the coming of peace on earth, and when everybody gets along. Over the years, he's also come to be something like, well, some people say Santa Claus, but it's more like the elf on the shelf, like somebody who's watching you all the time to make sure that you're behaving and doing right by everybody. So the little story I have, And I would tell it, but it's kind of like our story. In the house that I grew up in, it was a really big house, and it had a really nice eating kitchen where we usually ate meals, and then it had a formal dining room. We had great big family dinners like the Seder. And there was a door for some very strange reason that I never figured out. There was a door that went to the outside from the dining room. And it wasn't, nobody ever used it. Except every once in a while, our neighbors on that side would come to that door. But, anybody else would just come to the front door. Or there was a door on the other side of the house that came into the family room, and that one got used a lot. But a door into the dining room didn't seem to make much sense. So the idea is that during the Seder, you put out this extra glass of wine for Elijah, and you set a place for him with a plate and food. And then at some point in the service, you open the door to let Elijah in. Now, in my grandfather's house, to come and join you at your Seder, in my grandfather's house, this was in New York, and it was traditional to really go find someone, like to go out on the street and find someone who didn't have any place to go to eat that night and bring them home to your Seder. We would just open the door, and Elijah never came, and eventually somebody would drink his wine. Except for 1 year, we were all sitting at the Seder and saying all the words we're supposed to say. And my father said, now we've put out this glass of wine for Elijah. And somebody knocked at the door, that weird door that nobody ever used. So, well, it was just the neighbor. But we all thought, the bunch of us kids, we were still pretty young, and we thought, Elijah actually came. So this is a story I found, and it's supposed to be told by a grandmother, and I'm supposed to dress up and like put on my grandmother glasses and a shawl and pretend to be a grandmother, but I think I look like a grandmother anyway, so I'm going to be the grandmother. So one day, all these children in the family were playing around, and somebody knocked on the door. This was not Passover, just somebody knocked on the door. And the little girl opened it and saw a beggar at the door, and he was all dressed in rags, and he had a sack over his back, and his shoes were full of holes. And he said, "May I come in and sit by your fire and have some food?" And this little girl knew that her parents didn't have a lot of money, and she said, my father's died and we don't have a lot to eat, but we really don't have anything extra. And so the beggar went on and went to the next door neighbor's house, they were equally poor, or maybe even poorer than this family. And the little girl saw the beggar go to the neighbor's door and saw the neighbor open the door and invite him in. And the next day, the mother was cooking dinner for Passover, and the dog, as dogs do, got in and grabbed the chicken and knocked over the dessert and just made a big mess. And they didn't have enough money to go and get another chicken, and they were all sitting there crying. And all of a sudden they heard a knock on the door, and it was their neighbor. And she said, "It seems that you've had some misfortune this year, and I would like to invite you to celebrate Passover with us. We don't have much, but we can stretch it. We can share." And so after the neighbor was gone, my mother said, "Well, who was that who knocked on our door yesterday?" And the little girl said, "It was a beggar, and I told him we didn't have enough and sent him away." And mother said, "Where did he go?" And the little girl said, "To the neighbors." And my mom Mom looked at the little girl and said, "Do you know who that beggar was?" The little girl said, "No." Mother said, "That was the prophet Elijah. He came to see if we are helping to make the world a better place by being welcoming and generous." And so this little family, they went next door and had a wonderful Seder with their neighbors. And the little girl, who was now the grandmother, said, "I never saw Elijah again. But ever since then, I try to treat everyone as if they were Elijah. And I find that there's always enough and always some to share." So that's the story about Elijah and how he comes to bring peace to the world and how he comes to test you and make sure that you're really being kind to everybody. Because when the beggar shows up at your door, he may be a beggar, but he might be Elijah. You don't ever know.
If we just talk of thoughts and prayers and don't live out a faith that dares and don't take on the ways of death, our thoughts and prayers are fleeting breath. If we just dream of what could be and do not build community and do not seek to change our ways, our dreams of change are false displays. If we just sing of doing good and don't walk through our neighborhood to learn its hope, to ease its pain, our talk of good is simply vain. God, may our prayers and dreams and songs lead to a faith that takes on wrongs, that works for peace and justice too. Then will our prayers bring joy to you.
So I have a confession to make, and it's about one of the 7 deadly sins. So right away, you know that we don't do a lot of confession in this church, nor do we talk about the 7 deadly sins. So before you get derailed by that, I want to just tell you a little bit of what I mean. I want to tell you that I've been struggling with the issue of envy. Not only when I go visit other clergy in Dallas do I have parking envy, but when I open up the newspaper and I see events coming to Dallas where people like T.D. Jakes and all these celebrities coming together to celebrate their faith, I have faith envy. What is faith envy? It's that feeling you get when you think, this person is powerful and has courage because they know that they believe that God holds them and that they've got it figured out, right? If you're sitting in these pews, you've probably had a question about some of that. That position that people come from that says, I've got it figured out and you don't. Now that is enviable at times. I want that, and in a sense, I've wanted that all my life. I grew up a Unitarian Universalist, of which gifts were many, especially the ability to be fluid in the different religious settings, to know a deep tolerance rather than to try to apply a tolerance, and many other gifts. But I've always wondered what it would be like to have that kind of faith, that unwavering faith, which is not something we typically have here, because we have more questions than answers. So when I read a story like the one Christine read, which about the woman on the raft, it triggers my faith envy. Here's a woman on a raft for 6 days, and what does she do? Besides the crying and the trying to survive, she is praying and singing religious songs and talking with God. I wonder what the Unitarian Universalist version of that is. Partly because I wonder if any of you can sing these songs without this book in front of you. When I was on my ride, after 6 or 7 hours of riding, I found myself singing hymns. And I'd start singing a UU hymn, and then I'd sort of peter out because I couldn't remember him. So then I'd start in on Holy, 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 or Oh God, our help in ages past. I'd make it right through that one. But if a UU is on that raft, what are we doing? It puts into question what our faith is. Now, the traditional answer to the woman being rescued would have been, or would be, that because she was faithful, because she prayed and sang songs, the helicopter arrived, right? There are lots of jokes about that. And I don't believe that. I actually think she survived because she was a person of faith. Not because of some magical moment where God answered her prayers, but rather because she had something to count on. She had some tools to use in that moment on that raft. Again, faith envy kicks in, because I wonder what those tools might be for us. Now, when you think about envy of any kind, you must know that envy comes from a kind of absence in your life, or some dis-ease, some feeling that you don't have enough. So take anything that you are envious of. Don't tell me you're not envious of something. Below the surface of that envy are two things. One is that there's some gap in you. There's some place that isn't full, that doesn't feel fulfilled. And you can try to do something about that. But even below that, I believe, is that we've bought into a kind of paradigm that makes the object of our envy the thing we want. So if we believe that the way of the world is that we work hard and we become millionaires and then we drive around in the super whatever top vehicle there is, if we buy that paradigm, then we will always feel envious if we don't have it. But if we can subvert that paradigm, if we can get out of that thinking, we can be free. So you remember in 7th grade at the dance when you were standing with your back up against the wall and thinking everybody else is having a good time? You had that thought because you bought into the paradigm that a good time was looking like something that you were looking at. So if we apply this to faith, it works like this. We have bought wholesale the idea that faith is made up of a strong belief, of some switch that is turned in our hearts and minds that goes from a very weak signal to an absolute signal. So when we turn on the TV next week and we see the celebrities at the T.D. Jakes event proclaiming their faith, we will be practicing the paradigm that faith equals belief. Now, if that is the paradigm, then most of us in this room are in really big trouble. Because that's not the paradigm that works in this church. So, second part of my sabbatical, I set out to work on this issue, this thing that has been nagging at me since I was a boy. Because I grew up a Unitarian Universalist, I wanted that faith that Eric and Raj and Amy had. But once I realized that I had bought their paradigm of what faith was, I had to figure out what was a replacement paradigm. And this is what I worked on this summer. Now, the first thing I did when I sat down at my little cabin in Vermont, in Walden, Vermont, as I joked with you last week, overlooking the pond, I was like a modern-day Henry David Thoreau. And I thought, man, if Henry David had had access to a computer and all those things, he would have had it. So the first thing I did was I sat down with a book by a Catholic. His name is Richard Rohr, and you've heard me quote Rohr before. This book was about prayer, because I was entering into this contemplative moment. The book is called Everything Belongs, and here's one of the first things I read. He said, "My religion has lost sight of Jesus' message. It has not tended to create seekers or searchers. It has not tended to create honest people, humble people who trust that God is always beyond them. We aren't focused on the great mystery. Rather, religion has tended to create people who think they have God in their pockets. People with quick, easy, glib answers." This is a Catholic, not a Unitarian, writing this. He says that's why so much of the West is understandably abandoning religion. People know the great mystery cannot be that simple. If the great mystery is indeed the great mystery, it will lead us into paradox, into darkness, and into journeys that never cease. God can most easily be lost, he said, by being thought found. God can be lost if we think we have found. So I'm sitting down to write a book on faith, and here's a Catholic telling me the first thing we must do is subvert this idea that knowing God equals faith. And there's a freedom in that. And the freedom is that if we are here to believe in that paradigm, we have already lost. But if we can replace it with another paradigm, we can live as courageous, faithful people. So what might that look like? Now know that this comes in the stream, the river of Unitarian Universalism. We've always been paradigm shifters. Go back to the 4th century, and our religious ancestors were saying Jesus was more man than God. And they repeated that over and over, and they said, the paradigm of Calvinism doesn't work. It says that we are all evil and that we are, some of us, predestined to be saved. And the Unitarians of that time said, no, we are all good. capable of sin, but good. That we are not predestined, that God would not condemn that which God created. So for us, paradigm shifters, it must include what Richard Rohr has said, that to be people of faith, we must be comfortable in the dissonance of our lives, not settling for easy answers. We must be able to go into the darkness, into the paradox, and be on journeys that never cease. So what I did in this writing project that I did was try to define a new paradigm for what it is to be a person of faith. What it might mean for us to hold this idea once again. Not that we are people of faith because of what we believe, but rather that we are people of faith because we know what we trust. We know what we are committed to. We know what we see when we look through the lenses of our souls at the world. So for me, faith has 4 elements, not just one. It starts with belief. It does mean that you have to think about what you believe and write it down and know it and reflect on it. It doesn't mean that that belief is once and for all, though. And that's essential, that you can revisit it, that it changes, that as you change, your belief can change. And that's core to who we are as a church. If you're here for the first time, I want you to hear that very clearly. And the second part of faith is that you understand what you trust. Not who you trust, but what it is you trust about living in this world. And thirdly, that you understand what you are committed to, or what you are loyal to. Beyond all the small loyalties, where is the biggest loyalty you can have? Where can you place that commitment? If everything was stripped away in your life and you were on a raft 75 miles out to sea, where would your deepest commitment be? And lastly, how do we see the world? How do you define what you see when you look at the world? Is it all chaos? Does it have purpose? Is there some evil trajectory that is taking over? What is the paradigm? What is the worldview? So for me, if we practice these things, then we become more supple as faithful people. We become more full of our own answers, not just answers that I can give you. Because what I am trying to say, and in some ways, is I'm giving you a path to explore one's faith. Not the easy answers, not the glib answers. What I'm trying to do is show us that we have a faith. One that can serve us with confidence, that we can wear like any other who proclaims the truth is theirs. Only ours must come with a sense of humility. Ours must come from deep self-exploration. Now, the first story in my book is about me on the top of a mountain in the Himalayas, and some of you have heard this story. It is why I am a minister today. Because I was a young man trying to find purpose and meaning. And I was going to become a Buddhist monk until I sat on a rock on top of the Himalayas and I heard the words, "Return home and serve your people." It was a kind of directive that said there's a way that you can claim yourself as a faith, from yourself as a person of faith, but not by claiming someone else's faith, but by claiming what is inside of you. And this is what pushed me to understand that the paradigm of faith can be something that each of us can create within, not just be given, not just say yes to and check off the box. So before I start selling my book, which doesn't exist yet, except on my computer, what I want you to hear is that faith is ours. We need not have some envy for others who proclaim it with a louder voice. But it is only ours if we work at it. If we work through what we believe and what we trust and what we are loyal to and how we see the world, if we know that, then we can know ourselves as people of faith. And in that exploration, we can create a readiness in our lives for the rafts that have cast us out into the sea and for the challenges we will inevitably meet. And they will walk us toward wakefulness, like the poet said. That kind of exploration will lead us to waking each day to the worship of the world, to knowing that there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground, to be awake and know the spiritual words. Get that the poet didn't say in the poem, I heard the words, I believe. She said, I heard the words, I can. Faith is being open to not knowing the answers to the questions we ask ourselves. It is in seeking a deeper response within a framework that pushes us to know ourselves more deeply. So if any of this makes a little bit of sense, know that you are in the right place. And the next time that you are cast out on a raft 75 miles out to sea and you can't remember any of these hymns, you will have the kind of faith that will get you through if you can do this kind of exploration I am describing. One that holds you in a deep place of trust and commitment, that is not handed to you as something you must just say yes to. But it is the exploration of life and truth and love that leads eventually to that yes that comes from deep within. Faith is way more nourishing, I think, in this way. Coming to know it, coming to understand it, rather than being given it. So that's what I did on my sabbatical. I rode my bike from here to Boston thinking of nothing, and then I sat by a pond in Vermont thinking of all this. And I hope we will all be better for it. Amen.
We extinguish the chalice today with the words by Lucinda Stephen Duncan. Eternal Spirit, whom we call God, you are our life. You are the best and the most beautiful in us and beyond us. Your spirit is in animals, birds, plants, and in people whom we do not know or who seem very different from us. All of us share the gift of life. Help us to remember that life is good.
For